the GOP, they had a great election night, and a lot of it was focusing on race and education. I wonder what your biggest takeaway is from the fact that that strategy worked, especially when you think about our country's history and sort of where we have been as a country and where we're going.
Yeah, well, Yamish, let me add my congratulations to Kelly, too. I'm so jealous that I'm not in studio with all of you tonight. It's nice to be in person again. But listen, critical race theory is the big lie of 2021 and the modern day Southern strategy that is appealing to white voters. Education is the 2020 version of economic grievance, that code buzzword from 2016. But listen, I mean, I was covering race as a reporter for the Associated Press before I became editor at large at the 19th. I know from talking to voters and from covering campaigns, race-based appeals to voters are increasingly a perennial aspect of GOP politics. It's one that the former president certainly capitalized on in his elections, but it's not new to our politics in this country, and it's one that current candidates are testing to see how successful this strategy can remain. And we saw that was effective, at least in Virginia on Tuesday night. As you mentioned, record turnout on both sides. I mean, Democrats and Republicans got more votes in this gubernatorial race than they did in 2020 and in 2017. But ultimately, you saw Youngkin winning out, and this was part of the message that resonated with Virginia voters.
And a quick follow-up, Errin, which is there are a lot of people who couldn't even define what critical race theory was, especially people who were against it being taught in schools, even though it's not taught in schools. I wonder what you make of that ability, the people's ability not to even be able to define what they are against, but also being very motivated by it.
Yeah, I mean, politics are emotional, and you don't get a more emotional voter than a parent in a conversation about education. Education being the second most popular issue with voters in Virginia, according to some of the polling that we saw. But look, this fight isn't even about critical race theory. As we saw, a lot of people weren't even really sure what critical race theory was. They just knew they didn't want it, right? But this is really just about kind of a larger conversation on a continuum in our country and frankly in Virginia about how history should be taught in our schools and recognized in our society. I mean, the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones has certainly been a part of this. The case for tearing down Confederate monuments has been part of this. There's still a debate among some people in this country about what the Civil War was actually about, whether it was about slavery or whether it was about states' rights. So, the idea that history can't really be changed, but it can be forgotten if it is not taught is something that we have to consider in this conversation. And we would think that we've already learned this lesson as a country, and yet we find ourselves here again because race remains, again, so potent in our politics.
Race absolutely is remaining potent. Dave, I want to come to you because you called this Youngkin race at 8:25. I saw your tweet and thought, okay, maybe I can go to sleep now because Dave has basically called this several hours later. The networks followed you in that. I wonder, can you talk a bit about how much this GOP playbook that Glenn Youngkin ran, can it be replicated in 2022 and even 2024? But also talk a little bit about the raw numbers that you saw and that you've been looking at.
Well, a couple of scary things here for Democrats. The first was the consistency of the swing towards Republicans that we saw on Tuesday. Virginia is a state that voted for Biden by 10, voted for Youngkin by 2.5. New Jersey, a state that voted for Biden by 16, it looks like Phil Murphy is going to win by 3.5. So if you were to superimpose that 12.5 swing on the entire House of Representatives in 2022, Democrats would lose 51 seats. Keep in mind, Republicans only need to pick up 5 seats for the majority. So this is wave territory. But the other scary part here is that Republicans are having success running candidates in the suburbs who don't look or sound like Trump. Terry McAuliffe's message the last 2 weeks was essentially Glenn Youngkin is Glenn Trumpkin. Every day under his governorship would be some version of Charlottesville or January 6th. Voters didn't buy it. Glenn Youngkin comes from the corporate boardroom. Virginia voters actually like those kinds of candidates. They elected Mark Warner, right? And it shows that Democrats are having trouble translating what's going on in D.C. to voters' everyday concerns, right? Voters are not looking at the infrastructure package and the debate over it as addressing their top 2 concerns, which are right now the cost of living and education. And on education, I don't think it was so much that voters endorsed Glenn Youngkin's position on critical race theory, so much as it became a catch-all for parents' frustration over what's happened with schools the last 20 months with closures. And when voters aren't happy with the status quo, they look for alternatives.
It did become a catch-all, especially when you think about transgender rights, when you think about the rights of LGBTQ people. That was all sort of lumped into this critical race theory thought. I also, though, want to stick with you, Dave, because I want to talk about Democrats and specifically they're losing white voters. I was looking at some numbers that NBC put out there. They were talking about white rural voters. They were also talking about voters without college education. Do Democrats have an issue here with their hemorrhaging of these specific voters, or maybe it's not as pronounced?
Look, this has been a growing problem for Democrats for a long time. And Terry McAuliffe won Fairfax County, the largest county in Virginia, by 30 points. He still lost the state because rural white turnout was extraordinary. Look, if you told me before Tuesday that Terry McAuliffe would win close to 1.6 million votes, I would have said he'd probably win. But he lost because the Trump base turnout was so massive. They are fired up at Joe Biden. The intensity of opposition to Democrats in Washington has amped up a lot in the past couple months. And I think one of the exclamation points underlying in the down ballot was that Democrats lost 2 districts south of Richmond that are plurality black. And it wasn't because black voters defected to Republicans. It wasn't because black turnout was poor. It was that rural white turnout was phenomenal.
Eva, first of all, I should say thank you for coming back on the show. Now you're with CNN, so I want to congratulate you as well for your new gig. You spent a lot of time covering the Virginia race. You were talking to a lot of voters. I saw a lot of your stories. Talk a bit about what you think Democrats did here, how they failed to win this race. But also, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it means for future elections.
Well, so Terry McAuliffe focused so intensely on Trump that it came at the expense of, or what it did was it drowned out all of his other issues. If you are just a casual observer of this race, you would think that Glenn Youngkin ran the more policy-focused campaign. And I think that actually is a complicated take. He ran an issues-focused campaign, and he was very disciplined with his message. But there wasn't a lot of depth to his day one game plan. It was succinct. It was easy to understand. He repeated it over and over on the trail. You could go to his website and read sort of the paragraph-long plan. But Terry McAuliffe, he had pages and pages of policy on his website. He had a 14-page plan for lifting up black Virginians. But you didn't think of that when you thought about Terry McAuliffe. All you thought was about Donald Trump. And so that was a really big mistake. There was a woman on the campaign trail that came up to Terry McAuliffe and said, hey, don't forget about the climate. And in his gregarious, politician way, he goes, go to my website, read the plan. And I'm thinking, well, why aren't you leading with this? Why are you leading with characterizing Glenn Youngkin as Trump? Another aspect of this race is Youngkin's team really kept him shielded from, I would say, lengthy interviews, right? So there wasn't a lot of picking away at the day one game plan. There wasn't the opportunity to ask him really rigorous questions. I would have loved to have had the opportunity to ask him, besides content of your character, what other messages and readings from Dr. King informs his ideology. I would have loved to have asked him more about this critical race theory. That has become an umbrella term for diversity, equity, and inclusion, white supremacy, systemic racism. It's become a catch-all for everything. That is how conservatives define it, not as just the academic legal theory that it is.